You smell it before you see him. Even now, 3 centuries later, you remember it. Not the cry, not the crown, the stench. The air in the room did not move. Curtains were sealed, doors shut tight, but the odor found you, wet copper, festering meat, rotted breath. You knew it came from him. From the emperor. His face was no longer a face. His lips had ulcerated and blackened. His tongue could barely move. His jaw drooped, misshapen, the entire lower half of his skull infected, eaten away, and he screamed, not once, not in rage, but in long, slurred bursts of agony that made even the most hardened royal attendants weep. He died in that scream, not with dignity, not with peace, but as if his very soul was trying to escape the rot that had consumed his flesh. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If what you're about to witness leaves you unsettled or awakened, consider subscribing. Not for the numbers, but to help these buried stories rise again. If it brings value, leave a like. If it stays with you, leave silence. It is the year 1700, in the fading heart of the Spanish Empire. The empire is dying, and so is its emperor. You are an attendant in the Alcazar of Madrid, a silent shadow among velvet drapes and whispering tapestries. You were never meant to speak, but you remember, and what you remember is not fit for court history. Carlos II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of his line, was born in 1661 and doomed from his first breath. His mother ruled in his name for over a decade, not because she was ambitious, but because her son could barely stand. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, his body twisted, his speech slow, his tongue too large for his mouth. He drooled when he tried to speak and collapsed when he tried to walk. He was king, but only in title. Behind palace walls, physicians whispered of corrupted blood, of a family tree so tangled that it bent in on itself. Centuries of intermarriage among Habsburg royalty had left Carlos with a jaw so malformed it was said he could not chew food. But that was only the beginning. By his 30s, Carlos was suffering from relentless infections, abscesses in his mouth, and neurological episodes. He forgot words, then faces, then how to swallow. Foreign ambassadors wrote that he looked more like a corpse than a man. He had no air, no control, no hope, and in the final years, his face began to disintegrate. Modern historians debate the precise cause. Some blame acute congenital hypothyroidism, others hydrocephalus, and many point toward neurosyphilis, a brutal infection known to eat through the skull and destroy the mind. What's certain is this: Carlos II died in agony. And you were there. The hidden rot. You first noticed it in the smell. Not strong at first, not yet putrid, just a sourness, like fruit gone soft too soon. The palace maids lit ambergris candles and soaked scented cloths in rose water, tucking them behind tapestries and beneath velvet cushions. But it didn't help. The odor clung, not to the room, but to him. Carlos was not yet 30, but already, the signs of death had begun to bloom beneath his skin. He had never been well. Born after 2 centuries of inbreeding, his lineage traced back on both sides to the same royal ancestors. His Habsburg jaw, grotesquely pronounced, made it nearly impossible to speak clearly or chew properly. His tongue swelled when he ate. He often choked. His spine was hunched. His hands trembled. You had once glimpsed him unclothed, being bathed by his attendants. The sight stayed with you. His legs thin as reeds, hips oddly wide, the body of a child stretched over the frame of a sick man. His testicles were small, shrunken. His urine smelled of rot and salt. But it wasn't until he reached adulthood that something changed. He no longer simply looked unwell. He began to decay. At court, physicians whispered of mysterious humors, of curses, of black bile. But what you saw was simpler. His gums bled when he smiled. His eyes yellowed, sores formed on his tongue, then along the inside of his cheeks. His teeth loosened, his breath impossible to mask. Each morning, his valet would scrape blood-flecked saliva from his pillow and wring out the linens. Carlos often refused to eat, not from pride, but because the pain in his mouth made chewing unbearable. His body grew weaker, but his court, paralyzed by ceremony and fear, did nothing. The doctors came. They spoke of imbalance, of melancholy, of invisible spirits. Their cures were worse than the illness. They bled him weekly, drilled into his skull with primitive trepanning tools, and insisted he drink mercury elixirs, believing it would purge him of his dark fluids. But mercury only fed the fire. His tongue cracked, his lips darkened, and then his upper palate began to weep, a thin, clear liquid that smelled of eggs left too long in the sun. The rot was no longer hidden. Blank, underscore, blank. They called it syphilis, but no one dared say it aloud. Today, physicians speculate with the benefit of time. The symptoms of tertiary syphilis are cruel and unmistakable. Bone destruction, facial ulceration, dementia and rage, paralysis, death by infection, slowly and publicly. In Carlos's case, the early signs were missed or ignored. Perhaps he contracted the disease at birth. Perhaps through a wet nurse. Perhaps through a long-dead mistress whose name history never kept. You'll never know, because in the court of Spain, such talk was treason. To accuse the emperor of carrying a venereal disease, the affliction of whores and drunkards, was unthinkable. Better to believe in sorcery. Better to blame witches. Better to say the devil had eaten the king's health than to admit that God's anointed had been rotting from within. In private, however, the royal physicians began to panic. They noticed the bone behind Carlos's nose begin to collapse, giving his face a flattened, mask-like appearance. A fist-sized abscess formed under his left eye, which bled through the tear duct. His eyesight blurred, then darkened. You remember when he was no longer able to read prayers aloud during Mass. His voice slurred. He drooled openly. His tongue dragged against his lower teeth when he spoke. His nose bled every time he sneezed. Still, he was expected to appear, to rule, to smile, blank, underscore, blank. And still, he was paraded like a man of glory. No one stopped the charade. The empire was faltering. Spain had lost wars, territories, honor, and its king, its last Habsburg king, was being propped up like a marionette, decaying in silks and gold. He was carried into rooms where he could not sit. His knees locked, his joints stiffened. Sometimes he stared blankly for hours, unblinking, as if his mind had frozen while his body festered. You were there the day his nose leaked black fluid onto a white linen handkerchief during an audience. The bishop said nothing. The French ambassador did not flinch. But you saw it. The way the odor made the servants gag behind their sleeves. And still, no one dared speak of death. In 17th century Spain, predicting the death of the monarch was a capital crime. Anyone who declared him near his end could be accused of treason. So they smiled. They perfumed the room. They changed his linens. And they waited for a miracle. But no miracle came. Only more screaming. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The whispers grew louder than the bells. Behind his back, they said he was cursed. They said his body was proof that the Habsburg line had angered heaven. They said his soul was trapped inside flesh too broken to carry it. The public was not blind. The people of Madrid had long known their king was unwell. But it was only in these years, when even the horses reared from his smell, and when flies gathered at the palace doorways, that the truth could no longer be hidden. He had no heir, no strength, no future, only rot, and as his screams began to echo across the marble corridors of the royal palace, you realized the emperor was not just dying. He was being eaten alive. The mask of power. You were tasked with preparing the chamber. Not as a guard, not as a noble, but as one of the nameless. The cloth holders, the ash scatterers, the ones whose faces never appear in paintings. And you were the first to see the mask. It was not gold, it was not royal, it was linen, soaked in spice oils, tied gently beneath his ears like the veil of a mourning widow. The mask was meant to hide the sores, to catch the drool, to shield visitors from the stench. But you knew, everyone knew, Carlos's face had entered a new phase, the collapse of identity. The ulcer beneath his eye had widened, splitting the flesh along his cheekbone. A patch of rotted skin on his lower jaw had sloughed off in the night, leaving behind a raw, weeping opening, yellow at the edges, black at the center. His gums no longer held his teeth. Most had fallen out, and so the mask was born. Not a symbol of dignity, but of denial. Blank, underscore, blank. A palace rebuilt for a rotting king. They did not close the court. They did not dim the music. Spain would not admit weakness. Instead, they altered the palace. Silk curtains were replaced with heavier damask drapes, not for luxury, but to hold incense. Windows were sealed, doors adjusted, air holes narrowed. The stench was to be contained, not cured. In the emperor's private corridor, a series of perfumed braziers burned amber, civet, musk, and even ground saffron, the price of which could feed a city. Physicians recommended burning vinegar and laurel to counteract the sickening odor of flesh. But nothing worked. The smell became legend. You heard how visiting dignitaries prepared weeks in advance, how they trained themselves to breathe shallowly, to mask their nausea with oil beneath their noses. The French ambassador reportedly fainted. A Portuguese envoy vomited behind a column. Still, Carlos greeted them. His robes were altered to fit his shrinking frame. His gloves were lined with herbs. The crown was set carefully on his head, not because it was heavy, but because his scalp had become too fragile to support its weight. His tongue no longer obeyed him. His voice, once merely slurred, now gurgled and hissed, echoing from a throat constricted by infection. Yet during audiences, he was expected to speak. Sometimes he tried. Sometimes he only screamed. Blank, underscore, blank. Mercury, arsenic, and a prayer for silence. The treatments had become more desperate. 2 new doctors, trained in France, arrived bearing promises. One advocated for arsenic tablets, believing it would cleanse the inner poisons. The other resumed the mercury regimen, this time in vapor form, placing Carlos in a tent of heated fumes. He emerged from the tent coughing blood. His skin, already thin and mottled, developed rashes and burns. His fingers peeled. His lips cracked until they bled. One eye began to cloud with fluid. And still, they called it a treatment. No one used the word syphilis. Not in public. Not even the physicians. They invented names. Melancholic degeneration, imperial humoral imbalance, decay of royal constitution. But you, who washed his linens, who poured out the pans of dark yellow fluid from beneath his bedding, who saw the blood in the basin, you knew. The disease was eating him from the inside out. And now, it had reached his mind. Blank, underscore, blank. His memory, like his face, began to disappear. At first, he forgot names, then days, then languages. He would begin a sentence in Spanish and end it in Latin, unaware of the shift. Then came the hallucinations. You heard him in the night, shouting at empty corners, screaming the names of kings long dead, calling out to a child he never had. One night, he wept for hours, mumbling that his mother was inside the walls and would not stop whispering. His court grew quiet. The nobles no longer held counsel in full voice. They whispered. They bowed lower. The jesters were dismissed. Musicians played only lutes, never trumpets. Loud sounds made the emperor flinch. His nerves had begun to spasm without warning. He would shake violently, then soil himself. And yet, he still lived. Every morning, he was dressed in the symbols of majesty. The velvet cloak, the jeweled sash, the sword he could no longer lift. And the mask, always the mask, until one day, it no longer stayed in place. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The flesh beneath refused to be hidden. It began to slip as he spoke. One string tore, then the linen sagged. What it revealed, no one would ever forget. The left side of his lower face had caved inward. Bone exposed. The jawline dissolved. A thin, sickening yellow fluid ran from the edge of his lip to his collar. And behind it, deep inside the ruin, you could see the movement of his tongue. Sluggish and bloated, no one looked directly at it. But no one could look away. A painter had once been summoned to capture a final royal portrait. He stayed only 20 minutes. The work was never completed. Carlos II had become unpaintable. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The illusion of majesty had rotted. And now, even his signature began to fail. His hand, once steady if slow, now trembled too violently to hold the quill. He would attempt to write. Fingers twisted. Ink spilled across the page like veins bursting. He cried each time. The ministers began preparing documents for him to sign with only a mark. They pressed his hand against the paper. They guided the pen. He barely noticed. They had built a nation on his name. Now, he could not spell it. And so the mask remained. Not just the one tied to his face, but the illusion of kingship itself. Spain, once a continent-spanning empire, now waited in silence, governed by a rotting man propped up by memory and perfume. You were there, when the ministers whispered of succession, when the nuns lit candles in secret, when even the priests wore gloves to touch him. They said the king was improving. They said he would rise. They said the scream was only a dream. But you heard it, and you knew. He was dying. Not quietly, not with grace, but one scream at a time. The screams in the palace. They say that palaces are quiet in mourning. But this one, this royal palace of Madrid, was quiet in fear. You remember the walls, cold stone, thick with history, trembling with sound, not music, not prayer, but screams. It began after midnight, almost every night. At first, soft moans, gasps, guttural coughing. But then, as the disease gripped deeper, the sounds became animal, inhuman, raw, gurgling and sharp. You were just beyond the door that first night, holding a pitcher of water with petals floating in it. For his throat, they said, but he never drank it. He was curled in the corner of his bed, mouth wide open, eyes not blinking, and from somewhere inside that ruined body came a howl so long you forgot to breathe. The guards outside wept. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The flesh knew no mercy. Carlos was no longer asleep. Not really. He drifted into half-consciousness, into fever. Sometimes he spoke in voices, different accents, different tones. Sometimes he screamed without sound, mouth open, lips trembling, but nothing emerging but drool and air. His face had begun to peel. The ulcers at the corners of his mouth joined into one gaping wound. His cheeks sank, revealing bone beneath thin membranes of inflamed skin. Flies were found in his chamber, feeding on the fluids that seeped from gauze pads lining his pillow. The sores at his temples had opened, revealing whitish, pulsing tissue beneath. At first, physicians tried to cover it. They bound his head in cloth soaked in myrrh and basil. But nothing stopped the leaking. One day, the cloth slipped. The queen, his second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, turned away and vomited in the hallway. She never returned to his chamber again. Blank. Underscore. Blank. He screamed at saints. He screamed at mirrors. What little sanity had remained was gone now. The king no longer recognized his confessors. He demanded confessions from dead bishops. He swore he saw Saint Isidore standing in the corner. He screamed at the crucifix, then apologized to it, then begged it to scream louder so he wouldn't feel alone. You heard it all. You brought candles and tried to light them with shaking hands. The wax dripped, the flames flickered, but still the room remained dark, because no light could soften the shadow of that voice. Some nights, he asked for mirrors. When he looked into them, he didn't see himself, but sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he screamed again, not out of fear, but because he realized he could no longer tell the difference between his face and death itself. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The palace changed its rhythm. Nothing was the same. The servants no longer sang as they swept the galleries. The court no longer rehearsed music in the salons. No ambassador would stay overnight. The nobles arrived only at dawn and left before dusk. The bells of the chapel were muffled. The footfalls in the corridors grew lighter, softer, as if every step might awaken something too horrible to survive. Some said the king was possessed, that he had been touched by witches, that the curse of the Habsburgs had reached its final, screaming fruit. But others knew better. They had seen the books, the charts, the family lines, how uncles had married nieces, cousins had borne cousins, generation after generation of genetic collapse that ended now, in this room, in this bed, in this throat of sound. And so the palace endured, not in silence, but in paralyzed obedience to a god who had lost his voice and kept only his pain. Blank. Underscore. Blank. They tried to muffle the noise. The physicians demanded he be drugged. They brought crushed poppy, wine thickened with laudanum. They forced honey and vinegar down his throat to coat his ulcers and dull the fire behind his eyes. Nothing worked. Even sedated, Carlos screamed. He screamed when they touched him. He screamed when they changed his bandages. He screamed when they did nothing at all. His throat grew hoarse. His voice cracked. But the screams continued, from some deeper place. Deeper than the flesh. Deeper than the lung. The chambermaids would not enter alone. Some quit the palace entirely. Others prayed constantly. Some believed the screams were not his, but of souls trapped within him, released each time his pain broke through. The archbishop, when summoned for mass, refused to perform it inside the emperor's room. He said, "The body has become a tomb before the soul has left it." Blank. Underscore. Blank. Even the walls tried to forget. You noticed the marble discolored. The velvet faded. The floors creaked louder than they had in years. The portraits were moved. The tapestries rearranged. It was as if the palace itself no longer wanted to be what it had been. The emperor had once walked these halls. He had once touched these stones with hands now shriveled, now too stiff to move. But now, his presence was different. He was no longer Carlos. He was suffering, incarnate, a creature made not of blood and bone, but of pain and stench and sound. Blank. Underscore. Blank. And then, one day, the screams stopped. No one marked the moment. There was no bell, no announcement, just a pause, a silence so sudden it rang louder than any cry. You were standing by the wall, holding linens that no longer needed changing. Inside, Carlos was still, his face, half gone, wrapped in fresh cloth, no longer twisted, his mouth open, not in scream, but in stillness. And just like that, the last voice of the Habsburgs fell silent. But the echoes remained. You could hear them in the stone, in the corridors, in your dreams, and long after the body had been washed, and buried, and forgotten. The palace still remembered the sound. The emperor's last rot. The death was not the end. You thought it would be. You believed, naively, that the screams had marked a limit. That now, with Carlos gone, the palace would return to air and silence and incense. But you were wrong. because he had not stopped decaying. He had only stopped moving. And the room, his final room, was still full of him. The bed sagged under his weightless frame. The gauze at his cheeks stuck fast to the wounds. When they removed it, the skin came too. The physicians refused to perform an autopsy. The royal family refused to open the body. There would be no embalming, not the kind used in other courts. The air was already too thick. The body was already too unstable. The jawbone had detached, sliding beneath the weight of his sunken head. So they covered him in roses and pine resin and tied the sheets closed with gilded cords. But even as they wrapped him, the fluid leaked through. You helped carry the body to the next chamber. The linen was warm, blank, blank. A coffin fit for a collapse. They had to commission it that morning. A coffin large enough for a man whose body was too soft to lift, too fragile to dress. 3 carpenters worked through the night, not to shape a coffin worthy of an emperor, but to build something that would hold his disintegration. The box was sealed with wax, pitch, and prayer. Inside, they stuffed the lining with cloves, bay leaves, and Spanish moss, not for ceremony, but for absorption. For all their rituals, they knew what was coming. You smelled it first, before anyone opened the chapel. The scent seeped from beneath the floorboards. A week had passed. The royal coffin had been placed in the chapel of El Escorial, the grand resting place of Spain's most powerful kings. But Carlos had no power left, not even over his body. The gases had begun to expand. The seams had begun to crack. And then, one night, the coffin wept. A guard found it, a thin stream of blackish-red fluid trickling across the stone floor of the chapel, pooling beneath the altar where incense once burned. And in the morning, the dogs came. Blank. The dogs of God licked the emperor. They were strays. No one knew how they had entered. Some said they were devils. Some said angels. But you were there. You saw them. 2 thin creatures with mottled fur, noses twitching, tongues slick. They crouched beside the coffin and lapped at the fluid as if it were sacrament. No one moved. Not the guards. Not the priests. Not even you. Because you knew what it was. That was no water. No wine. It was Carlos, the emperor who had screamed until his voice died. The emperor who had ruled nothing but his own rot. The emperor who now fed the beasts beneath the floor of his own tomb. Blank. A funeral wrapped in perfume and shame. They burned barrels of sandalwood to disguise the smell. They soaked palm branches in vinegar and waved them before the courtiers. They lined the procession with silver censers, every one of them filled to the brim with powdered amber and rosemary. And still, people fainted. They collapsed along the walls of the cathedral, not from grief, but from nausea. The musicians played with white cloths over their faces. The choir sang through tears, not of sorrow, but of suffocation. Carlos was buried on November 1st, 1700, in the crypt of El Escorial beside kings who had ruled empires, who had conquered lands and hearts. But his legacy was not conquest. It was corruption, of body, of blood, of name. There was no applause, no cheers, no relief, only the closing of stone over the soft, liquefied ruin of a man who had once been called God's anointed. Blank. The silence after screams. Spain fell quiet. The court was shuttered for a year of mourning. The crown passed to Philip of Anjou, who would become Philip V and ignite the War of the Spanish Succession. But you didn't leave. You stayed in that palace long enough to smell what remained. The room where Carlos died was sealed, but the smell lingered in the walls. The floors were polished, but flies still gathered. Some said they heard weeping behind the chapel altar. Even weeks after the body was moved, you never spoke of what you saw. Not to the next king. Not to your children. Not to the priests. Because to remember Carlos was to remember the failure of the divine. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The legacy of a rotting god. Carlos II had no children. No empire left intact. No final word. His legacy was genetic collapse. He was the last of the Habsburg line in Spain, a dynasty that had ruled across continents. And he died screaming, his face dissolved, his mind shattered, his body consumed by a disease that no one dared name. Modern medicine now believes he may have suffered from multiple conditions: congenital hydrocephalus, hypothyroidism, epilepsy, and, likely, neurosyphilis in its tertiary stage. But at the time, no one spoke the word. No one needed to. They had smelled it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. You are still a witness. Years passed. The palace changed. Kings came and went. But in the walls of that chamber, where candles once flickered, and dogs once licked the rot of royalty, your silence remained. You had seen what few would ever believe. Not a man dying. Not a king fading. But an emperor who was devoured by the very bloodline that crowned him, and by the very rot that his court had perfumed for decades. He did not die quietly. He did not die with dignity. He died as a warning. And now, you remember. Final reflection. He was born a king. He died as a lesson. You watched it all. From the early days when attendants whispered of his misshapen body, to the final hours when not even death could contain his decay. You saw the candlelight flicker against his bones. You smelled what rot smells like when it comes from royalty. And now, you cannot forget, Carlos II was not merely the end of a life. He was the end of a myth. That bloodlines are sacred. That kings are chosen. That power can outlast the flesh that holds it. His death was not just medical. It was symbolic. A dynasty so obsessed with purity had collapsed inward. And when it did, it produced a man who screamed himself to death, whose body fed stray dogs, and whose face could no longer wear a crown, because it had no shape left to hold one. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The Spain he left behind would be torn apart. His death sparked a war. His silence birthed 1,000 whispered superstitions. And the Habsburg name, once spoken with reverence, became a warning etched in bone. Today, you remember him not through portraits or coins, but through the smell of linen soaked in infection, the echo of a scream no priest could silence, and the drip of fluid on marble in a holy place. Not all kings die with trumpets. Some die with muffled sobs behind closed doors. Some die with their jawbones detached and their final breath filtered through gauze soaked in myrrh. But they all die, and no mask, of gold, of faith, of legacy, can cover what time will reveal. Blank. Underscore. Blank. And now, you too remember. And that is enough to keep him from vanishing forever.